Hi everyone, you're very welcome to this morning's event. This is a hybrid event, so I'll be virtual as well our presenter, and then we have panelists that are live in the Dublin studio. But wherever you're joining from, you're very welcome. Just to give you a sense of how it's going to go, I'll say a few words of introduction, I'll hand over to our presenter, and then we're going to have a panel discussion all together. And just to introduce myself, I'm Orlaith Delargy. I'm the EMA lead on biodiversity with KPMG. So today's event is advancing the biodiversity finance agenda, looking out to COP15. I thought it was worth explaining some of those terms just so that we're all on the same page starting off the discussion. Firstly, very basic, what is biodiversity? We're talking about the variety of all life on Earth. And sometimes that term is used interchangeably with nature, but really nature is actually bigger than biodiversity. Nature is kind of referring, we can think of four realms, so land, ocean, atmosphere, and freshwater. And biodiversity is the living component of that. Also in the title of this event is COP15. So what's COP15? Well, it's the 15th meeting of the parties to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. They're going to meet in December in Montreal. And what they're aiming to agree is kind of like a global agreement for nature, for biodiversity, similar to a Paris agreement that we've had for climate. And we have a draft text for that agreement with a lot of very interesting draft targets and goals, particularly relevant to finance and business. One of them being addressing the biodiversity finance gap, which is huge. We aren't spending enough on biodiversity, and the solution to that will come from the public and private sectors. The removal of harmful subsidies as well, it will be really important. We're still spending a lot of money kind of in the wrong direction, and removing those will be key. And then another one very relevant to business and by extension the financial sector is mandatory reporting of impacts and dependencies on biodiversity by large corporations. So all of those are draft. If you know how these negotiations go, if it's in brackets, it's kind of all still to play for. But we'll see in December what the ultimate outcome will be. But even beyond the UN, we know that nature is really firmly on the agenda. So at global level, we have the Voluntary Reporting and Disclosure Framework, TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. We're going to hear a lot more about that in our presentation. At the European level, we have a very ambitious EU biodiversity strategy, which sets out targets for member states, including the protection of 30% of EU land and waters by 2030, a nature restoration law, and significant reductions in pesticides and fertilizers. Also at the EU level, there's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which both require organisations to report on biodiversity. And in Ireland, we are translating all that kind of policy mix into our own national biodiversity plan, which is due out in February 2023. And by the way, the consultation on that plan is now open if you want to go check it out and have your say on it. So against that regulatory backdrop, a lot of stuff going on in the biodiversity space. I'm delighted to welcome Carolin and Leesha, our presenters. So Carolin has worked on sustainable finance and environmental markets for over 20 years now across a range of sectors, infrastructure, agribusiness. She's worked with government, financial services. And Carolin is KPMG Australia's head of social and sustainable finance, but she's also KPMG's global lead on natural capital and biodiversity. So we're delighted to have her here. Carolin represents KPMG on the task force for nature-related financial disclosures. So she's actually a member of the task force, one of 34. And we're delighted to have her here today. And I'll just pass over to you, Carolin. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the kind introduction, Orla. And it's a great pleasure to join you today at the Irish Climate Finance Summit to talk about nature-related risks and opportunities and the TNFD. So I hope you can see the slides. Okay, I think they're just being displayed now. So the first question, which might run through your mind right now is, so why does nature matter to business and investors? Well, all businesses depend on nature and its services, either directly or through their supply chain. And we tend to think of nature as free, but it's not. And with the rise of the ESG movement, there is a much broader understanding of value creation now taking hold. And this more holistic value creation narrative goes well beyond the financial and manufactured capital, in the sense that recognize the value of nature in the same way as traditional capital. And that is about meaningfully recognizing the value of nature in a more integrated and holistic way in accounting, disclosure, and risk management processes, economic models, and also financial markets. So if you could advance to the first slide, please. Thank you. So what this means, is that non-financial information that might not have been relevant a few years ago in business, lending, underwriting, and investment decision making is so now. Let's look at some nature in numbers. I'll briefly touch on some of those figures. The World Economic Forum estimates nature's contribution to the global economy to be US 125 trillion per year. And with more than half of the world's economic output dependent on nature, any damage to our oceans, rivers, lakes, land, and the atmosphere and living things comes at a cost. Nature degradation and biodiversity loss affects resources, supply chains, and community wealth. And it's decreasing the value of assets and investments and bringing with it considerable financial risks as well. Unsurprisingly, the latest global risk report released by the World Economic Forum in February this year ranks biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse as one of the top 3 risks humanity will face over the next decade. So instead of underpinning valuable natural resources, we are paying to mitigate ongoing losses. But conversely, the transition to a nature-positive economy is estimated to create around 400 million new jobs and could unlock up to US 10 trillion in annual business values. So it's evident, that investors want to understand these risks and opportunities to identify their own exposure and make decisions about where to direct their capital. Next slide, please. And that gives me a good segue to the TNFD. The TNFD was established in response to the growing appreciation of the need to factor nature into financial and business decisions. When the task force first embarked on its journey about 18 months ago, we set out to develop and deliver a practical and consistent risk management and disclosure framework to enable organizations to understand, assess, and manage their dependencies and impacts on nature. The ultimate objective of the TNFD is to redirect the global flow of funding away from activities that harm nature and towards activities that benefit nature. The TNFD is a global, market-led, science-backed and government-endorsed initiative. It has received very broad support by the global finance community, business, service providers, world-leading scientific organization, standard-setting bodies, knowledge partners, as well as governments, with a collective footprint in 180 countries, representing organizations with around about US 20 trillion of assets under management. The TNFD has been endorsed by the G7 Finance and the G7 Climate and Environment Ministers, and it's also included in the G20 Sustainable Finance Roadmap. Financial regulators are all very much engaged in the TNFD through the network of Greening the Financial Systems. And the TNFD framework aims to really support organizations on a journey to integrate nature into governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and target setting. And as Ola said, The TNFD is broadly seeking to align with the 2 global targets in the UN Convention on Biological Diversity and the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And this Global Biodiversity Framework is that multilateral treaty which is expected to set and adopt an ambitious global goal for nature, kind of like the Paris Agreement for Nature, throughout the COP15 process in Montreal later this year. Next slide, please. I'll just briefly touch on the approach the task force has adopted in developing the framework has very much been driven by one of open innovation. The materials which have been released to date are working documents and have kicked off. The beta version 0.3 is due to be released later this month. There'll be another version 0.4 due in February, and the task force is set to launch the final framework in September 2023. And each round of feedback, testing and piloting seeks to really progressively increase the sophistication of the subsequent framework versions and enable organizations to progressively align themselves with the final framework release. And based on the feedback provided by the market participants, I might add that as well. It might be relevant for the Irish country context. The TNFD will convene also focus group discussions around emerging themes or by geographies or sectors. And based on the market demand, the TNFD is also supporting the creation of national consultation groups in select markets to expand the awareness about the TNFD and encourage feedback and pilot testing of the framework. So next slide. I'll just touch on the actual draft disclosure recommendations, and as I said, these follow the actual 4 pillars of governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets, and are designed to help provide better information to support boards and risk management level executives to ultimately make better and more nature smart capital allocation and asset evaluation decisions. They also enable better understanding of the concentration of nature-related risks and opportunities based on insights into nature dependencies and impacts. And of course, these disclosure recommendations may also be used by public authorities to assess systemic risks in the financial system itself. And next slide, please. In addition to the draft, okay, so yes, I'll just jump on perhaps, the actual, touch on the actual climate-nature nexus, and we will hear from David Carlin later in the panel today. But the key takeaway from this slide is that the TNFD actually has sought to maximize the consistency of language and architecture with the existing climate-related disclosure recommendations from the Task Force of Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD. In addition, it will also seek to align itself with the emerging global baseline of standards in sustainability reporting, which is currently under development by the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB. And I quite like to illustrate that the TNFD's approach with the iceberg model, above the surface, really alignment with the TCFD approach and language, the nature-specific approach very much under the surface in guidance to sectors considered most at risk. And sector-specific guidance will follow in subsequent releases of the framework, and the financial services sector in various manifestations, be it banks, asset owners, asset managers, public and private, will be the first cab of the rank. And by following that consistent structure, it is envisaged that companies will link together their disclosure on climate and nature-related risks and opportunities. So the two frameworks, the TCFD and the TNFD, are expected to be very much complementary and encourage and enable organisations to tackle climate and nature-related risks in tandem. But there are also some important differences and new components, and I'll quickly touch on the two most important ones. Firstly, the emphasis on location. So identifying the most important metrics is more straightforward in climate change reporting. Obviously, we've got the actual universal metrics of CO2 tons emissions avoided. However, unlike climate change, where we've got this universal measure, nature is obviously much more multifaceted, and biodiversity loss can vary significantly depending on the location. And secondly, it's the double materiality. In contrast to the TCFD, which you might be already familiar with, which is limited to disclosure dependency related risks, the TNFD is adopting a double materiality approach and considers the two-way interactions with nature, meaning that organizations should not only disclose just how nature may positively or negatively impact the organization's immediate financial performance from the outside in, but also how the operations of an organization's positively or negatively impact nature from the inside out. Next slide, please. And I'll briefly touch on the actual additional guidance which has been released by the TNFD, and that is the LEAP process. So the LEAP process, it's really a practical science-based step-by-step guidance approach on how organizations can actually implement the TNFD draft disclosure recommendations. And the LEAP process involves 4 core phases of analysis. They're broken down into 17 steps. Each of those phases are framed by guiding questions: locate your interface with nature, evaluate your dependencies and impacts, assess your risks and opportunities, and prepare to respond to nature-related risks and opportunities and report to investors. So it is a voluntary guidance, as I've said, to assist organisations with their internal assessment and analysis to apply the disclosure recommendations. And as you can see, it's quite an iterative process. And the next release of the better framework version will have an augmented version, specifically also for the financial services sector. Next slide, please. I thought I'll touch on very briefly actually on how the task force really frames and understands nature-related risks. So nature-related risks are the potential threats to a business or an investor from its impact and dependence on nature. The starting premise and the way the task force thinks about nature-related risks is that the underlying business model of an enterprise and its perceived value to investors depends in various degrees on reliable and cost-effective access to natural capital and the ecosystem services this natural capital provides. And organizations also have impacts on this natural capital, which may be positive or negative. And these factors are described by the TNFD as dependencies and impacts. So in short, today's nature impacts and dependencies can create tomorrow's risks and opportunities. And using an agri-sector example, the impact of beneficial insects, and dependency on nature to provide a suitable habitat, for pollinators, who in turn directly provide an ecosystem services to pollinate crops, for example. So the general principle of diversification of dependency on nature is very central to the effective risk management, particularly like for financial institutions. And nature-related risks can be grouped into three categories. As you can see, the physical risks, the transition risks, and also the broader systemic risks. And those systemic risks can really then also manifest themselves in what we call, a contagion, meaning there's an exposure to nature-related risks at one or more financial services organizations can really spill over into the financial services system as a whole. And the Financial Stability Board, the FSB, which, as you'd be familiar, is an international body that monitors and makes recommendations about the global financial system, together with the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a coalition of about 87 central banks and supervisory institutions, very much agreed that climate change and nature risks represent a systemic risks for the entire financial services and also the real economy. So perhaps we'll move on to the next slide in the interest of time. I'll just briefly touch on the actual nature-related opportunities. And nature-related opportunities can really occur when businesses mitigate the risk of natural capital and ecosystem services through, for example, transitioning to more efficient services and processes which use less natural resources like water, or through the adoption of circular economy principles, or even through the strategic transformation of business models, products, services, and investments that actively seek to hold and reverse the loss of nature. Opportunities could also come through the implementation of nature-based solutions for decarbonization, for example, blue carbon, or supporting these solutions through access to innovative green financing solutions or insurance. And I'd like to just close off by with this last slide here by giving a bit of a directional estimate of nature-related risks for economic sectors. Really, as nature-related risks become more severe, organizations across all sectors will face different degrees of disruption, depending on sector and geographical places in which they operate. And we'll probably unpack this a bit more in the panel, but sectors considered most at risk from biodiversity loss are clearly food and agribusiness, mining and extractives, but also manufacturing, industrial manufacturing, with supply chain who is highly reliant on nature, like we've seen in fast-moving consumer goods, for example, but also fashion and apparel, life sciences, and utilities, and also infrastructure. The financial services sector is also one of the sectors considered most at risk. Why? Because banks, asset managers, and insurers are not only contributing to nature loss through their lending, investment, and underwriting decisions, but are also impacted by nature-related risks through their exposures to borrowers or investees in high-risk sectors, which can then, of course, spread across an asset portfolio and ultimately spill over into a systemic risk of the entire financial services sector. So I hope I've provided you with a bit of a taster within 15 minutes, and I'll leave it there and hand back to Orla, and we can unpack and share some reflections in the panel. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Carolin. That was brilliant. Yeah, and appreciate you didn't have an easy task cramming all that into 15 minutes, but we do have a brilliant panel here now to discuss, and obviously we'll bring Carolin back in as well if you want to make any further comments. But just to introduce our great panel in the Dublin studio, we have David Carlin. David leads the TCFD program for the UN Environment Programme Finance Initiative, so UNEPFI, some of you might be familiar with. He has worked on climate scenarios, climate risk assessment, and climate governance, particularly with the banking sector. We also have Michael Bennett. He joins us from the World Bank, and he's head of market solutions and structured finance in the Treasury Department there. He's spent more than 20 years with the bank and leads work on new structured investments and catastrophe risk financing. And we have Eoin Fahy. Eoin is with KBI Global Investors and is their chief economist and head of responsible investing. He oversees the firm's approach to responsible investing and sustainability. So panel, illustrious panel, you're all very welcome and thank you for joining us. Maybe going first to Eoin, just wanted to get your reaction really to what we've just heard. We've heard about the TNFD framework. Does your organisation plan to use the TNFD guidance or disclose against it, or?
Yeah, I think absolutely strongly welcome TNFD. I think it is, I suppose with hindsight, my regret is that we the industry, the planet in a way, didn't start this process much earlier because it is still some considerable time, a number of years really, I think, still behind the equivalent TCFD process relating to climate. So really, really strongly welcome it. It's fantastic to see the kind of analysis that's been done, the progress that has been made so far, although there are aspects where less progress is made and we may get a chance to talk about them. But the only problem, I suppose, is how young this process still is, unfortunately. So, it's probably, 7, 8 years really since, since investors first came together at meetings like this or some webinars like this to talk about this newfangled concept called Scope 1 and 2 emissions and what that meant for our portfolios and concepts like carbon footprints and how to measure them and all that type of thing. And here we are quite a few years later talking about the early stages, very early stages of talking about similar concepts for nature. So it just emphasises, I think, the importance of moving this along quickly but carefully, of course, at the same time, because our industry, I think, is very much in what I might call an open door situation in terms of doing something about biodiversity. When I talk to portfolio managers, when I talk to competitors, peers right around the industry, I generally hear people saying that we know biodiversity is really, really important. It's right up there with climate. And probably with biodiversity of people as opposed to biodiversity, what you might call ordinary diversity. So those three topics, diversity, biodiversity and climate, are probably the three big issues that investors are focused on. But when we want to look at the diversity of, for example, a board and look at the gender diversity, the racial diversity of a board, we have the data, the framework, it's very easy to do. When we want as investors to focus on an aspect of climate change, carbon emissions, whatever it might be, we have the data there to do that pretty easily. We have a framework, we have the metrics, we know what to do. Whether we do it, we all do it as quickly and effectively as we should is another matter, but we know what we need to do as an industry to help the companies in which we invest move towards a carbon-free future. When it comes to biodiversity, I think as investors, we're all really interested in the topic. We all get that it's completely important. There's no resistance there, but we don't know what to do. I think it really is as simple as that. There are a few things we know, but there are so many things where we just don't really know what it is we should be doing as investors. And I get this from my colleagues as portfolio managers. I've been asked, how do we learn more about this topic? How do we build this into our investment process in some way. And I think TNFD is going to be very, very helpful. Probably, though, still in quite a few years' time, but I think it'll be very helpful in that process. I would certainly expect that once we move further down the process and once TNFD is more developed and finalised, I would certainly hope that we would try to implement it as quickly as possible, or at least those parts of it that are relevant to investors and investment institutions. So overall, strongly welcome it. Wish we'd done it a few years earlier, and in a way can't wait to get stuck into this process when it's finalised.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Eoin. And maybe just ask, I suppose, a similar question to David. You've got the TCFD experience. What's your reaction now to see the kind of younger brother coming behind or younger sister coming behind?
Yeah, so I think it's tremendously important, as Eoin mentioned. I do wish this had been done in parallel, but I think one of the things that we're seeing as I play an advisory role on the TNFD pilots that we run within UNEPFI is specifically where the TCFD was effective. We figure out how to bring those things in, and you can see those 4 pillars, that structure in the presentation is very self-consciously connected to what TCFD had done. But we also see some limitations. The TCFD came out with their annual report just last week. And in that report, a lot of really good progress, but also questions around implementation and around application still remain open and still remain ongoing. So I think taking some of those learnings, bringing them in. Another key piece, of course, is bringing in the elements of things such as double materiality. So a lot of the learnings, by treading this road first, I think it's given us a leg up. But one of the challenges conceptually is, 1, the further development, but 2, the fact that institutions are now saying, okay, we're just getting our arms around climate. How do we bring this in? And I think the answer is using a similar framework and realizing in a lot of places that these are overlapping and non-optional, but highly connected pieces. So good governance on climate and good governance on nature are going to look very similar. Having a strategy that is thinking about where risks exist, understanding those things, you're going to need some different information for that, but that way of thinking, the designation of who is going to be involved and responsible, a lot of these things can be learned. And so I'm very optimistic that institutions will move up the curve, and I think that the TNFD itself continues to learn from what is going on the climate side, because as climate is a part of nature, similarly, these frameworks will be part of the way that firms overall manage their environmental impacts and risks.
Yeah, no, I totally agree there, David. And maybe, we've heard that this is a very new framework. Maybe to bring in Michael, where is your organisation on its biodiversity journey, and, how far have you got?
Yeah, thank you. The World Bank is an international organization with a very simple and clear mandate, which is the eradication of extreme poverty. And we see biodiversity very much through that lens of development. So issues like food security, climate resilience for things like restoration of mangroves are all part of for us, it's part of a development issue. And we have been one of the largest official funders of biodiversity projects. In 2021, we funded about $3 billion of biodiversity projects in, I think, 15 separate countries. That is very much classic official sector support, things like loans, concessional loans, grants. And now what we're looking to do is expand our focus beyond using our own balance sheet in that way through official sector support to coming up with ways to bring in the private sector and private investors through blended finance, essentially, so that we can expand what we're doing and start giving investors exposure to biodiversity risks, which up till now has been very difficult if an investor wanted to invest to find the assets. So most recent thing we did in that regard was a bond we issued earlier in the year, $150 million US dollar bond, where the money raised by the bond, or portion of it, goes to projects to protect the black rhino populations in South Africa. This was the first time this sort of risk had ever been put into the market. came with support from the Global Environment Facility, and we think this is a really exciting development because we saw, as I said, $150 million worth of real investor interest in financing a specific biodiversity project. So that's something we're really hoping to build on in the future.
And Orla, if I could just jump in there very quickly as a follow-up, if I may. I think that it's great to hear about what I think of solutions and products that aren't just products, I mean financial products, that aren't, that show that an approach to biodiversity is not always about that you have to sell this or you have to avoid that or you have to not do something, but also that you can challenge finance to something and investments to something that will have a positive benefit. Because so often we think about, oh, well, you know, if there's some issue that investors need to deal with, it means you must sell this, you must avoid that, you must, you know, have less of the other. It's important as well, both in the TNFD framework, which absolutely puts an equal balance on risks and opportunities, but also that we in the financial community look at the opportunities and the solutions just as much as the challenges and the risks.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. We all need a bit of, we probably all gravitate a little bit more towards the negative because this, you know, there is a crisis and so on, but there's a big story to tell on the positive side as well, the opportunity side. So it is great to hear new products like the one put forward by the World Bank. And maybe coming back to you, Eoin, you know, where is KBI on its biodiversity journey?
Yeah, it's probably split in two because, like any company, there's issues around our own operations, which, in the case of investment manager, though, are much smaller, I suppose, in terms of our impact, positive or negative, than those of our investments. In terms of our own operations, we're probably fairly typical, or hopefully a little bit better than typical for a small company with 60-odd staff. So what we've done is we've got involved in a couple of native woodland plantations around the country. One in Roscommon, where we planted an area. We funded the planting of an area of native to Ireland tree species. We have a problem, as you may know. And you'll certainly know, Orla, that in Ireland, whereby the vast majority of forestry in the country is not native anymore, we lost that forest, the native forest, I suppose, about more than 100 years ago, and we're very gradually trying to get back our native species. So we're involved in a project there of funding a few hectares, I forget the exact amount, of forest there as a one-off project. We've also funded forestry in a local school in Dublin through a project called on Quill Beag, which means little forest, which is pretty self-explanatory in the grounds of a school. So there's little projects like that we've been involved in. Also, what we've done more recently, more recently as well, is focused on staff education and training. So I mentioned already that I have had a number of colleagues come to me and say, you know, I need to know more about diversity. Tell me where to go. So we did a couple of things on that front, but the most important of which probably was relatively recently. In fact, just within the last month, we ran a program, very simple, sort of 5-10 minutes training on biodiversity for every member of staff. On a 10-minute online module. They did a module a week for, I think it was 5 weeks. Just really basic training about diversity, but it helps. And it helps raise the profile of diversity, it helps people understand what we're doing, and it gives people a basic knowledge about that, so about diversity. So that's another little step that we've taken quite recently that I think was very well received by our staff, actually, and something we're doing as a very concrete step. On the investment side, it's much harder. So while we do the steps ourselves, and we do also things like beach cleanups and so on, where staff volunteer to go and do that, the really important bit, I suppose, is aligning our investments with biodiversity, and that is much harder. We know exactly, as I said already, we know exactly what to do about climate change. We have to go and do it, but we know what to do. So we engage with companies and ask them to reduce their emissions, and we have all the data that shows how much their emissions are this year, last year, the year before, what their plans are, what their capex plans are. We obviously won't invest in companies, for example, that are increasing coal production, and we over-invest or we direct finance to companies that are providing solutions in the area of climate change. So that's all relatively straightforward. When it comes to that for biodiversity, we're stuck. We don't have an obvious framework and metrics and data where we can go and do that in biodiversity. I really wish we had, as I said earlier on. We're starting to get there, and one of the things that we did one of the things we did last year in 2021 was we reported to CDP for the first time, and then we did that again this year. And what was a real challenge at the time, but I'm glad they did it, was this year for CDP for a financial institution, we had to report on the biodiversity module within CDP. So that was really interesting because that opened our eyes to at least some of the things we should be doing or could be doing that frankly we hadn't really thought about before. So I would sort of point anybody with an interest in this area in financial institutions to report to CDP, and particularly the biodiversity module. So we've done that. The first step about taking action, I think, is to report and to know what you're doing and what you should be doing. And that was very useful from that point of view. Other than that, we're doing some basic stuff as we can on an ad hoc basis. So we're engaging with companies where we know there's a biodiversity issue in the company and asking them to change their behaviour. We're asking companies questions about the biodiversity, but we still don't really have that great framework and metrics that we have on climate. And the missing bit of TNFD, of course, so far, the only bit that hasn't really been fleshed out at all is the metrics part of TNFD. If you look in there, you'll see that basically TNFD are saying, we'll get back to you on the metrics. I think they said that there were 3,000 different metrics. Imagine it, 3,000 different metrics being used around the world by various organizations for various things relating to biodiversity. We need to get, I don't know, 4, 5, 3, 6 measures that are used by our industry that we can target and we can framework and we can go after in a sense of really trying to make progress.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot in there, Eoin, and actually just on the staff education piece or anybody that needs education, I just want to flag that there's a Finance for Biodiversity pledge, and they have just recently produced a kind of training toolkit for financial market participants. So it's kind of it's set up as a PDF. You can go and watch all these videos and read all these articles. So I'd encourage anyone that's really just new to the space to go and check that out. It's quite good. Just conscious of time, so I'm going to bundle the last couple of questions together, but I do want to bring in Carolin just to respond to the metrics piece on TNFD. If you had anything to comment there, is that the missing piece of the puzzle?
Very much so, and really enjoyed the actual feedback and reflections from the panel. Look, I think what I'm hearing actually, is the task force has its work, cut out. As I said, we're probably halfway through, another 18 months, yet to go until September 2023. The task force just actually met for the first time actually in person in London a couple of weeks ago, where we'd made some pretty quantum leaps in terms of providing the actual guidance on metrics, both at an assessment stage, but also at a disclosure stage. And I think, Eoin, you've touched on a really important point as well. Our aim is to make this as practical and implementable by organisations as we possibly can. And obviously, biodiversity is much more complex, than climate. But at the same time, we actually need to distill very complex biodiversity and ecosystem realms into a decision useful metrics which can be operationalized by the financial services sector. So stay tuned for version 0.3, which will be coming out on the 4th of November. There'll be much more guidance, actually, not only on the metrics, but also on our approach to double materiality and the sector-specific guidance. And look, I think it's fair to say, also David, mentioned we're learning, very much from the TCFD, and in itself actually the framework is really standing on the shoulders of giants like the CDP, like the National Capitals Coalition, like the great work which has been done by our science and knowledge partners, and really actually looks to galvanise the best of breed in that new global consistent framework. And perhaps one last comment here as well on the education and planning. I think you're absolutely right in pointing that out, building the internal competence and capability of financial services and risk management to assess their organization's capacity and even evaluate, starting to test and pilot the TNFD framework will be absolutely vital in order to not only help to inform the task force, but also to prioritize the evaluation and focus, on the actual practical engagement investors can have with companies or investees. And this in itself actually is a really important signaling effect. And of course, the key barrier here, and it's been touched on, as well, is the actual data challenge. And I may just also refer people actually on the call and on the panel to the TNFD data catalyst, and this has been a new initiative actually also by the TNFD, which really aims to bring together a range of actors from across the nature-related data landscape sector to really start, collaborate and operationalize, those metrics in a practical sense, because the cost-effective and decision-useful information and the data to underpin those metrics and ultimate disclosure will absolutely be key in the credibility and the veracity of the framework once it's been finalised.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so the TNFD data catalyst, we need to check it out. Just keen that everyone would have another chance to speak. So I might go to David, Michael, and Eoin then. And if we could just, if you could just give your view on top challenge, on top maybe opportunity, or top kind of action that interested parties, that the audience can take getting started on biodiversity in the financial sector. So maybe to you first, David.
Yeah, so it's been a great session. The three things that I would flag on challenge, I would say data and definition, and really what are we trying to measure and what are those effective metrics for measuring it, and then how do we get the data to do that. As far as thinking about where we go from there, I think coming up with those definitions, the work that the TNFD is doing and the work that many institutions are already doing themselves in exploring what measures are going to be most relevant and most connected to the impacts that they have on nature and nature has on them, are really doing some of that important piloting work. And from an opportunity side, I think similar to climate, understanding how to work sustainably and to develop operating models that are compatible with nature is a tremendous opportunity. And there's so many ecosystem services now that we're valuing that we see are being either underutilized or imperiled, that their preservation and expansion could be of real opportunity. So I think that we needn't end on a negative note of all the work to do, but also on this significant opportunity that exists here with biodiversity.
Yeah, great. And Michael?
Yeah, well, the big opportunity we see is to create more products for the investment community, people like Eoin's firm, to buy, to allow investors to participate in biodiversity solutions. And the principal challenge we have to do that is that biodiversity often doesn't produce clear revenues, because when we're looking to create investment products, we generally use a securitization technique where you're taking revenues from the project. And biodiversity, the big challenge we have is finding those revenues, which can exist because there's obviously tourist benefits, there's other benefits to biodiversity projects, but that's the big challenge that we're looking at now to create these investment products.
And Eoin, a few words from you to close.
Yes, I think in terms of the challenge, it's data. It's getting numbers and metrics. Again, sound like a broken record, so apologies for that, but it's getting frameworks and metrics and above all data that we can use in biodiversity in the same way that we can use on issues like gender and racial diversity, and especially that we have and can use on the climate side. In terms of the opportunities, I've spoken about that already. It really is to be able for us to have investment products, as we've already identified in some cases, but it's limited as yet, which aren't just worried about, it's not just about things to avoid, but things that are solutions or solutions providers, investing in companies that are tackling the challenges of biodiversity. And I must just mention that the floor manager has just asked me to pass along to you here from the studio that we're into overtime. I think we're being asked to finish up. Thanks.
All right. Great. Well, I'll do that. And thank you so much to the panel. Thank you to Carolin for the presentations. And thank you all for listening in. Hopefully we'll see you next year with a lot more action taken. Cheers, everyone.